Okay, hello everybody, this is Antonio Wolf, continuing the essay on natural law. We are now, last time we read the critique of empiricism and its connection to the state of nature, and then this time it seems we're continuing on to rationalism. It should be interesting. We can now... excuse me. We now turn to consider infinity, the principle of the a priorism which opposes itself to empiricism. The manner in which empiricism arrives at its views and in them mixes up the complex with the simple, contrary to the concept, is in the absolute concept, or infinity, purged of its vacillation, and the incomplete separation of the two is made total. On a lower plane of abstraction, infinity, regarded as the absoluteness of the subject, is stressed in eudaimonism generally, and it is stressed in the particular field of natural law by the systems which are called anti-socialistic and posit the being of the individual as the primary and supreme thing. But infinity is not raised there to the pure abstraction which it has received in the idealism of Kant and Fichte. Oh, yeah. Sorry, I forgot to turn on the page. There you go. So already we see apparently there is a link between rationalism and eudaimonism, which is a part of Aristotle's virtue ethics. And then obviously there's a link between that and Kant and Fichte, because they are the arch rationalists of ethics. This is not the place to expound the nature of infinity and its multiple metamorphoses, because, since it is the principle of movement and change, its essence is nothing but the unmediated opposite of itself. Something interesting to note about infinity. In other words, it is the negatively absolute, the abstraction of form, which, as pure identity, is merely pure non-identity or absolute opposition, which, as pure ideality, is, with equal immediacy, pure reality. As the infinite... Oh God, let me get a drink. Alright, I hope that's better. In other words, it is the negatively absolute, the abstraction of form, which, as pure identity, is immediately pure non-identity or absolute opposition, which, as pure ideality, is with equal immediacy pure reality. As the infinite is the absolutely finite, as the indeterminate is absolute determinacy. There you go. If you want to know more about the infinite, check out my videos on Science of Logic Chapter 2 on that. That absolute transition into its contradictory, which is its essence, and the disappearance of every reality into its opposite, can be checked in no way other than by proceeding empirically, fixing one of the two aspects, that is, reality or the subsistence of the opposites, and abstracting from the contradictory the nullity of this subsistence. Well, that is very interesting. The absolute transition into its contradictory, which is its essence, and the disappearance of every reality into its opposite, can be checked in no way other than by proceeding empirically, fixing one of the two aspects, that is, reality or the subsistence of the opposites, and abstracting from the contradictory the nullity of this subsistence. I would say that's actually true. not quite sure exactly in what sense Hegel means this here, but that's exactly what I describe this as, that reason, in a way, has to be experienced before you can say what it is. Therefore, concepts have to first be thought out. You can't just be given the concept and know it. You have to actually think with it or think it. And then you know exactly what it is. This real opposition pits complex being or finitude against infinity as the negation of multiplicity and positively as pure unity. The absolute concept thus constituted provides in this unity what has been called pure reason. But once more, the relation of this pure unity to the multiplicity of beings standing over against it is itself a double relationship, either the positive relation of the existence of both or else the cancellation of both. So this double relationship would be the excluded middle of these so-called laws of thought. You know, the relation of this pure unity to the multiplicity of beings standing over against it is itself a double relationship, either the positive relation of the existence of both, so you know, both true and false, or else the cancellation of both, neither true and false. So, or more formally, either both A and not A, or neither A nor not A. However, this existence and its cancellation are both to be understood as only partial, for were the existence of the two absolute, they could not be related at all, while if the complete cancellation of both were settled, there would be no existence of either. This partial existence and partial negation of both, quote, the opposition of a divisible ego to a divisible non-ego in the ego, end quote. I assume that's from Fichte. That is, in the relation which just for this reason is a partial one, is the absolute principle of this philosophy. In the former positive relation, the pure unity is called theoretical reason. In the negative relation, practical reason. And since in the latter relation the negation of the opposition is primary, and hence the unity is more subsistent, while in the former relation the maintenance of the opposition is primary, and hence multiplicity is primary and more subsistent. Therefore practical reason appears here as real and theoretical reason as ideal. Alright, we following along so far here, or do I need to go over this a bit more? I suppose for those listening who have no background with Hegel, I feel sorry for you, because this assumes a lot. This is Hegel going on over generalities of his method, but not really revealing his method. So it's kind of useless. It's only insightful on on a formal level, and that itself is not really insightful at all. Sorry, just taking care of something. But anyways, if you're not following this so far, don't worry very much about it, because it really doesn't matter too much for what goes on when it matters. Once he starts getting into the proper issues of rationalism, it becomes more clear what all of this methodological description concerns. But it is plain that this character belongs wholly in the sphere of opposition and appearance. So the opposition of theoretical and practical reason. For the pure unity posited as reason is of course negative and ideal if what is opposed to it, the many, here the irrational, simply subsists, just as it appears more subsistent and more real when the many are posited as negated, or rather as something to be negated. But this irrational many, since nature is posited in opposition to reason as pure unity, is irrational only because it is posited as the non-substantial abstraction of the many, while reason is posited as the non-substantial abstraction of the one. But regarded in itself, the many is just as much absolute unity of the one and the many as unity is. And the nature or theoretical reason, which is the many, must, as absolute unity of the one and the many, be characterized conversely as real reason. The ethical reason, however, which is unity, as absolute unity of the one and the many, must be characterized as ideal reason, because in the opposition reality is on the side of multiplicity, while ideality is on the side of unity. Alright, so ethical reason must be characterized as ideal reason. Thus, in what is called practical reason, we can recognize only the formal ideal of the identity of the real and the ideal. And in these systems of philosophy, this idea should be the absolute point of indifference. But this idea, and by the way, this phrase, absolute point of indifference, is something that, if I remember correctly, Hegel gets that from Schelling, because Schelling also speaks of his philosophy as the absolute being the point of indifference. And if you read, for example, the Freedom essay, you find that formalism still being used by Schelling in it. But this idea does not arise from difference, and the ideal does not attain reality. For although the ideal and the real are identical in this practical reason, the real remains flatly opposed to the ideal. This real is essentially posited outside reason, and practical reason resides only in its difference from it. The essence of this practical reason is understood as a causal relation to the many, as an identity that is absolutely infected with a difference and does not go beyond appearance. This science of ethics, which talks of the absolute identity of ideal and real, belies its own words. Its ethical reason is, in its essence and in truth, a non-identity of ideal and real. Okay, so so we have the opposition of theoretical and practical reason. Pure unity is on the side of reason, or pure reason, or theoretical reason, and multiplicity is on the side of the practical reason. This unity, despite the fact that each unity should be explicitly a unity of both, in order to be true in the sense of ideal with a capital I, as Hegel says here, they're each failing in this distinction, so long as they're distinguished. It says, for the pure unity posited as reason is of course negative and ideal if what is opposed to it, the many, here the irrational, simply subsists, just as it appears more subsistent and more real when the many are posited as negated, or rather as something to be negated. But this irrational many, since nature is posited in opposition to reason as pure unity, is irrational only because it is posited as the non-substantial abstraction of the many, while reason is posited as the non-substantial abstraction of the one. But regarding itself, the many is just as much absolute unity of the one and the many as unity is. And nature of theoretical reason, which is the many, must, as absolute unity of the one and many, be characterized conversely as real reason. The ethical reason, however, which is unity, as absolute unity of the one and the many, must be characterized as ideal reason, because in the opposition, reality is on the side of multiplicity, while ideality is on the side of unity. And I apologize for the background music, nothing I can do about that. So I mean, this makes sense insofar as, like, ethics concerns practical reason, and practical reason already assumes that there's clearly an existent and substantial difference between what is and what ought to be, and that's why we have ethics in the first place. Because if what is and what ought to be were immediately the same, then we wouldn't have any need for ethics now, would we? But continuing, thus in what is called practical reason, we can recognize only the formal ideal of the identity of the real and the ideal. And in these systems of philosophy, this idea should be the absolute point of indifference. So I mean, I suppose that the formal ideality of it is that, at least implicitly in ethics, there is some notion that the ought and the is must be united and unitable in some way. It's just that practically this is not, or empirically this is not the case. So while ethics is has theoretical presuppositions about this unity, its practice is also the way in which this unity is overcome, or this distinction is overcome. Nonetheless, in the way that it's usually put, especially in rationalism, this is formal, in the way that regardless of content, the form is what matters to what is right. And then there's a practical sense in which through ethical action we change the form of the content of the real, of nature or the empirical world, and by giving it the proper form we make it ethical and bring it into the form of the good. But this idea does not arise from difference, and the ideal does not attain reality. For although the ideal and the real are identical in this practical reason, the real remains flatly opposed to the ideal. This real is essentially posited outside reason. Practical reason resides only in its difference from it. The essence of this practical reason is understood as a causal relation to the many, as an identity that is absolutely infected with a difference that does not go beyond appearance. This science of ethics, which talks of the absolute identity of ideal and real, belies its own words. Its ethical reason is, in its essence and in truth, a non-identity of ideal and real. So yeah, and just being this distinction that between what is and what is not, what is and what ought to be, implicitly makes a distinction between what is real and what is ideal. Ethical reason was characterized just now as the absolute in the form of unity, and thus, since it is posited as something determinate, it seems immediately in this determination to be posited just as essentially with an opposite. But the distinction is that true reality and the absolute in this regard are wholly free from this opposition to nature, and are the absolute identity of ideal and real. The absolute is known, according to this idea, as this identity of difference, whose determinate character is to be unity in the one case and multiplicity in the other. And this determinate character is ideal, that is, it exists only in infinity according to the concept expounded above. It is as much superseded as posited. Each of them, the unity and the multiplicity, whose identity is the absolute, is itself a unity of one and many. But the unity whose ideal determinate character is multiplicity is the persistence of the opposites, that is, positive reality, and therefore is necessarily in opposed and double relation. Since the real subsists in it, its identity is a relative one, and this relative identity of the opposites is necessity. Since this identity is thus in difference, its relation itself, or the identity of the relation, must be something different. It is also necessary that both unity and multiplicity be primary in it. This double relation determines the twofold aspect of the necessity or the appearance of the absolute. So, again, descriptions of the structures of the concept and the method. And really what Hegel said so far does not contradict what he solidifies later on in his system, but I think that with an eye to the later system, at least to me, this is very apparent that he still did not have a completely conscious grasp of how this actually worked, despite the fact that he was at a point that it seems that he could do it. So all these descriptions are very formal. I mean, they're true to what he's doing, but at the same time, it's not telling us how it's working. Since this twofold relation applies to multiplicity, and provided we term indifference the unity of the difference, which stand on the other side, and in which that reality of the many is superseded, then the absolute is the unity of indifference and relation. And since the relation is double, the appearance of the absolute is determined, 1, as the unity of indifference and of the relation, or the relative identity in which the many is primary and the positive, and 2, as the unity of indifference and of that relation in which the unity is primary and the positive. The former is physical nature, the latter ethical nature. And since the relation is double, the appearance of the absolute is determined as 1 as the unity of indifference and of the relation, or the relative identity in which the many is primary and the positive. 2 as the unity of indifference and of that relation in which the unity is primary and the positive. Okay. The former is physical nature. Yes, this maps very, very highly with his later philosophy of nature, and the latter ethical nature. Danny comments, a difference essay similar in that regard. I haven't read the difference essays, but I would not be surprised if it's full of the same kind of descriptions and intimations of the absolute. And since indifference or unity is freedom, while the relation or the relative identity is necessity, therefore each of these two appearances is the oneness and indifference of freedom and necessity. Substance is absolute and infinite. This predicate, infinity, implies the necessity of the divine nature or its appearance, and this necessity finds its expression as reality precisely in a double relation. Each of the two attributes itself expresses substance and is absolute and infinite, or the unity of difference and relation. And in the relation, the unity's indifference is so posited that the many is primary in the relation of the ones, while in the relation of the others, the one is primary, or the thing that sweeps onto the others. But since unity is primary in ethical nature, even in its relation, therefore ethical nature is free in this relative identity, that is, in its necessity. Or since the relative identity is not superseded because the unity is primary, the second freedom is so determined that the necessary is for ethical nature, but is posited negatively. Now, if we were to isolate this aspect of the relative identity of ethical nature, and to recognize the absolute unity of indifference in this relative identity, not as the essence of ethical nature, but as the aspect of relation or of necessity, then we would stand at the same point at which the essence of practical reason is characterized as possessing absolute causality or as being free, and necessity as being only negative, but for that very reason still posited. As a result, this very freedom does not escape from difference. A relation or relative identity is made the essence, and the absolute is conceived solely as negatively absolute or as infinity. The empirical and popular expression whereby this notion, which conceives ethical nature purely under the aspects of its relative identity, has won such wide acceptance, is one that the real under the name of sensuousness, inclinations, lower appetites, etc., moment of the multiplicity of the relation, and reason, moment of the pure unity of the relation, do not correspond, this non-correspondence being the moment of the opposition of unity and multiplicity. Two, that reason consists in willing out of its own absolute self-activity and autonomy, and in constricting and dominating that sensuousness, moment of so determining the relation that in it unity or the negation of multiplicity is primary. Alright, so there's a distinction of the real and reason. They don't correspond. And then there's the reason consists in willing out of its own absolute self-activity and autonomy, and in constricting and dominating that sensuousness. So reason overtakes nature, opposes it, but does not eliminate it. The reality of this notion is grounded on the empirical consciousness and on the universal experience of discovering within oneself both that duality and also this pure unity of practical reason, or the abstraction of the ego. There is no question of denying this standpoint. On the contrary, it has been characterized above as the aspect of the relative identity of the being of the infinite in the finite. But this at least must be maintained, that it is not the absolute standpoint in which the relation has been demonstrated and proved to be only one aspect, and so the isolation of the relation is likewise thus proved to be something one-sided. It must be maintained that, since morality is something absolute, this is not the standpoint of morality, and there is no morality in it. As for the appeal to ordinary consciousness, it must just as necessarily include morality as that standpoint which is the principle of immorality, since relation isolated for itself is posited as being in itself and not as a moment. Empirical consciousness is empirical simply because the moments of the absolute appear in it dispersed, side by side, one after another, scattered. But it would be no ordinary consciousness if morality did not occur in it this way. This formal philosophy could choose amongst these diverse appearances of moral and immoral which occur in empirical consciousness. Philosophy, not ordinary consciousness, is at fault for having chosen that the appearance of the immoral, and for having imagined that it had the true absolute in the negative absolute or infinity. The construction of this practical philosophy rests on the presentation of what this negative absoluteness can achieve, and we must trace the chief features of the false attempt to exhibit a true absolute in a negative absolute. And by negative absolute, it's just, pure a priori formalism, as opposed to a philosophy or concept that includes both the content and the form. It is obvious at once, since pure unity constitutes the essence of practical reason, it is so completely out of the question to speak of a system of morality that not even a plurality of laws is possible. For what goes beyond the pure concept, or since it's pure concept insofar as it is posited as negating the many, that is, as practical, is duty. For what goes beyond the pure concept of duty and beyond the abstraction of a law no longer belongs to this pure reason. Kant, the man who has expounded this abstraction of the concept in its absolute purity, recognizes full well that practical reason totally renounces the content of law and can do nothing beyond making the form of fitness of the wills maxim into supreme law. The maxim of the arbitrary will in choosing has a content and includes a specific action, but the pure will is free from specification. The absolute law of practical reason is to elevate that specification into the form of pure unity, and the expression of this specification taken up into this form is the law. If the specification can be taken up into the form of the pure concept, if it is not cancelled thereby, then it is justified and has itself become absolute through negative absoluteness as law and right or duty. Okay, let me reread that. So it is obvious at once that, since pure unity constitutes the essence of practical reason, it is so completely out of the question to speak of a system of morality that not even a plurality of laws is possible. So, pure formalism being pure, the extreme side of unity is so unified that there is no difference, and we have no. We don't even have a system of morality because there can't even be different distinctions of law in it. For what goes beyond the pure concept, or since it's pure concept, insofar as it is positive as negating the many, that is as practical, is duty. Since this pure concept is duty, for what goes beyond the pure concept of duty and beyond the abstraction of law no longer belongs to this pure reason. Alright, so I assume this is the formalism charge against Kant that's so famous. That sure, Kant can arrive at the formalism of the categorical imperative, which logically speaking is basically the law of identity. That insofar as your maxims follow the law of identity, they are valid. So Kant, the man who has expounded this abstraction of the concept in its absolute purity, recognizes full well that practical reason totally renounces the content of law and can do nothing beyond making the form of fitness of the will's maxim into supreme law. The maxim of the arbitrary will in choosing has a content and includes a specific action, but the pure will is free from specification. The absolute law of practical reason is to elevate that specification into the form of pure unity, and the expression of this specification taken up into this form is the law. So the practical reason chooses a maxim, which will be a specific content, raises it to the form of pure unity, which is the law of identity, and the expression of specification taken up into this form is the law. If the specification can be taken up into the form of the pure concept, if it is not cancelled thereby, then it is justified and has itself become absolute through negative absoluteness as law and right or duty. Alright, so here one must remember Kant has a few formulations of the categorical imperative. I think one of them is, treat everyone as an end in themselves. Everyone meaning human persons who are ends in themselves by virtue of being rational beings. The other one is will only that which can be universalized to everyone. And will not self-contradict. I think that's about it. Yeah, it's the universalization, and the universalization is itself an ordinary language form of just saying the law of identity. Because, for example, Kant says, if you, for example, have the maxim, "I will lie whenever it is convenient for me to lie." Or rather, actually, here's one he specifically uses. I will break my promises whenever it is convenient for me to break my promises. And Kant says that is a self-contradiction because making a promise that you don't intend to keep is incoherent with the concept of promises itself. So the fact that there's a contradiction there between the specific action taken and the concept being operated with, that's what makes it wrong. If it fails to self-identify content operationally. There's also a sense in which he says, the reason you should not steal whenever you want or under any circumstances really is because if you universalize that and everybody steals, then nobody has property, and what the hell does property mean? But property is required for the very concept of stealing to even have any meaning. Therefore, the concept of stealing contradicts itself. It doesn't come into the proper form of the law. Specification cannot be taken into the form of the pure concept because it is cancelled when you try to universalize it upon itself. So that's what makes stealing wrong for Kant.
Yeah, I guess one question I have about the categorical imperative that I always wonder about is okay, obviously with the stealing example, of course, it doesn't matter the specificity of the context in which you can't universalize it. It isn't justifiable. But how can you I'm trying to find a good way to explain my question about how Kant would think about it. But are you able to say some particular aspects of the circumstance, those particularities can be universalized? For example, oh, if you're old, you don't have to work, for example. Could you universalize that aspect of it, or does it still go out to do you get what I mean? How many specificities can you add in there where you can make it a universal and justify it?
The thing doesn't specify, so you can you can make it as specific as you want. To the point that perhaps you put it in a form that seems to not be contradictory.
Yeah, but then that just seems to me well, you can universalize anything.
Yeah, and this doesn't seem quite right, because then Kant wouldn't have written his famous piece on on the supposed right to lie for what is it, humanitarian reasons or whatever.
Axe-wielding murderers.
Yeah, and that's yeah, and in that one, Kant says lying is wrong, period, under all circumstances, no matter what specifications. So it seems that certain things, no matter what the specifications, just will not play out for Kant. And I should probably, it's been a long time since I read that. And I only read an excerpt of it, so I should probably read the whole thing. Because there's some explanation as to why that is.
Yeah, and I don't know, do you think Kant addresses it in a good way? Because again, in some circumstances it does make sense to allow for some specifications, but also some specifications it doesn't make sense to allow for. But what is the criteria for that?
Yeah, it seems to me Kant was against specifications.
Okay, but for the example of the elderly, for example, we can't expect the elderly to work. Obviously not. We can't expect the disabled to work.
Sure, and then if you just said, when somebody reaches a certain age, they should be able to retire, and you universalize that, well, nothing bad results. So, society doesn't crumble. After all, there's young people still working, so they can support the old people. Blah blah blah. So, but that already assumes a whole lot of shit that actually
Yeah.
It's part of the problem. It's part of the problem with the categorical imperative. In its abstraction, you don't know what societal conditions you're even under, such that the very duties that you may be imposing upon yourself can even be carried out.
And really, in some ways, we want people pursuing different behaviors than other people. We don't want it to be universalized that everyone's a poet, for example. It won't be. But still, like, it's good that some people are going to be poets, some people aren't going to be poets. You wouldn't want to universalize either, that everyone's a poet or no one's a poet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it doesn't specify what counts as moral, what counts as not, beyond the form. So some stuff that might seem to be like amoral. Somebody's like, what if I could make that into a maxim? Well, why not?
But can you even? It just seems unclear to me in like a lot of circumstances how you can even make it a universal maxim, you know? Or what you can or can't make a universal maxim.
Well, there's plenty, like, you could universalize it, and it doesn't have any real consequence, like saying, well, I will that whenever I'm having a good day, I should eat cake. You universalize that to everyone, so whenever anybody's having a good day, they should eat cake. Is there a contradiction there? Well, no. Does this actually provide for anything meaningful? No. So yeah, there is an issue of content to the categorical imperative. It's not quite clear what you should apply it to, and why we should care. Like the obvious thing is about the self-contradiction, but say for example in the phenomenology, Hegel says, well, sometimes there may be certain relations in society, certain structures that themselves are unjustified. So Hegel says, for example, in the maxim that that you should not steal, because if you made it, well, I should steal whenever I really need things, then the concept of property and the respect of other persons in relation to that property goes away, regardless of how badly you need it or not. And Hegel in the phenomenology brings up, well, this assumes that property is even a valid thing in the first place. Maybe it's some kind of arbitrary thing we've made up. Of course, later on he justifies property in philosophy of right, but in that passage in the phenomenology, he just brings it up as a question of, like, the categorical imperative doesn't justify the specific things that we're applying to. It already takes them assumed as justified. So, is it wrong to steal if it turns out that property is an illegitimate category of, logically speaking? Well, then no.
Yeah, and that gets to the problem that, I forget his name, the East Texas guy whose lecture we watched.
Rick,
but you could say, like, okay, with the stealing example too, I will steal, but I don't care if people steal from me. It can be universalized.
I don't think that's so much an issue, because like the universalization part is not that whether you mind. It's whether also, because I think like it must have. I haven't read it, so I haven't read like Kant's own theory of the state. I assume he ties it to the theory of the state, in which like the state itself, or society as such, as a whole, is one giant, like, shares in one giant categorical imperative, and so like any individual whether they're okay with it or not shouldn't matter much, if at all. But the question is, if you did universalize it, if everybody did do it, it would be contradictory and it would, destroy itself, its own foundation. And then you would have the whole issue. Well, then property wouldn't mean anything, and blah blah blah. But then you have the other side of it, which is, well, then does property mean anything ultimately? Should we even have it? In the sense that, is it valid to have it? Is it justified that we have property in the first place? And that's not quite obvious. At least not to a lot of the philosophers at the time. Although a lot of them did take property to be important, not everybody agreed that it was a fundamental thing that we all needed. Like, for example, Rousseau.
Some people now.
Like Rousseau, said, that the idea of private property was a bad thing in the first place, and it would have been better had the the famous phrase that it would have been better that if for the first person that drew an imaginary boundary around a plot of land and called it theirs, that everyone else in society fucking turned on them and beat the shit out of them and never let it go any further.
Man is born free, yet everywhere he finds himself in chains.
But anyways, let's continue. Good discussion on that. But the content of the maxim remains what it is. A specification or singularity in the universality conferred on it by its reception into the form is thus a merely analytic unity. And when the unity confirmed on it is expressed in a sentence purely as it is, that sentence is analytic and tautological. And the production of tautologies is in truth what the sublime law-giving power of pure practical reason's autonomy in legislating consists of. Tautologies, identities. The pure identity of the understanding expressed in theoretical terms as the principle of contradiction remains exactly the same when it is turned to the practical form. When the question, what is truth, is put to logic and answered by logic, it affords to Kant the ludicrous spectacle of one man milking a he-goat and another holding a sieve beneath. The question, what is right and duty, put to and answered by pure practical reason, is in the same position. Kant sees that a universal criterion of truth must be such as would be valid of any and every knowledge, regardless of the difference between its objects, but that since using the criterion is abstracting from the whole content of knowledge, while truth concerns just this content, it is clearly quite impossible and absurd to ask for a general test of the truth of such a content. Since God, Jesus Christ, it's a Kant sentence. Of course, it was really long. Kant says that, quote, a universal criterion of truth must be such as would be valid of any and every knowledge, regardless of the difference between its objects. But that, since using the criterion is abstraction from the whole content of knowledge, while truth concerns just this content, it is clearly quite impossible and absurd to ask for a general test of the truth of such content, since the test is also supposed not to concern the content of knowledge. In saying this, Kant is pronouncing judgment on the principle of duty and right set up by practical reason, for practical reason is the complete abstraction from all content of the will. To introduce a content is to establish a heteronomy of choice. But what is precisely of interest is to know what right and duty are. We ask for the content of the moral law, and this content alone concerns us, but the essence of pure will and pure practical reason is to be abstracted from all content. Thus it is a self-contradiction to seek in this absolute practical reason a moral legislation which would have to have a content, since the essence of this reason is to have none. All right. Let me reread this because starting from the... When the question, what is truth, is put to logic and answered by logic, it affords to Kant the ludicrous spectacle of one man milking a he-goat and another holding a sieve beneath. The question, what is right and duty, put to and answered by pure practical reason is in the same position. Alright, so I assume that, well, now this clearly is connected to what he's saying here about the understanding having only a tautology, a self-identity, and having no content beyond that. So, when Kant is asked, well, what is truth, he says on purely logical or rational grounds, he says that's a ludicrous spectacle of a man milking a he-goat and another holding a seed beneath. That's a funny way of saying jerking off a goat. And another holding a seed beneath it. So the seed would be the understanding. And I suppose milking a he-goat would be doing something that doesn't even make sense to begin with, which would be asking a nonsensical question. And then getting, obviously, a nonsensical result either way. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, sorry. I was just going to say, there is a Serbian kid at my school who would tell tall tales about stuff like that, milking a he-goat or, but I'm not getting into that.
What's his name, by the way? Ralph? Or Rolf?
Rolf.
No.
The question of what is right and duty put to and answered by pure practical reason is the same position. So, pure practical reason is just the sieve. If you try to put the sieve through itself as a content, it's just not going to do anything. Kant sees that, quote, a universal criterion of truth must be such that it would be valid of any and every knowledge, regardless of the difference between its objects. Okay, that makes sense so far. It would be valid for everybody, regardless of the difference between its objects. The criterion of truth would be valid, regardless of objects. But that, since using the criterion is abstracting from the content, the whole content of knowledge, while truth concerns just this content, it is clearly quite impossible and absurd to ask for a general test of truth of such a content. So using the criterion abstracts from the whole of content of knowledge, while truth concerns just this content. It is clearly quite impossible and absurd to ask for a general test of the truth of such content, since the test is also supposed not to concern the content of knowledge. Okay, so we have the criterion of knowledge, but the criterion of knowledge itself is not knowledge, it's only the criterion of knowledge. It's not, the criterion of truth is not the truth, it's just that which tests the truth. And the truth concerns the content. So it is clearly quite impossible and absurd to ask for a general test of the truth of such content, since the test is also supposed not to concern the content of knowledge. Alright, so you can't ask for the truth of content as such, because then you'd be applying the criterion, but the criterion is already the test of truth, but it's only a formal test of truth because it itself has no content, and the content itself is only true insofar as it follows, or it's in the form of the criterion, right? Therefore, it would be pointless to ask for a general test of the content because the general test is the criterion itself. And the criterion is already that which is without content. Okay, that makes sense to me. Everybody following that, or is there more that I should say? Alright, seems either everyone's asleep or everybody gets it. I assume the latter. If this formalism is to be able to promulgate a law, some matter, something specific, must be posited to constitute the content of the law, and the form given to the specific matter is unity or universality. Quote, that a maxim of thy will shall count as the same time as a principle of universal legislation. End quote. This basic law of pure practical reason expresses the fact that something specific, constituting the content of the maxim of the particular will, shall be posited as concept, as universal. But every specific matter is capable of being clothed with the form of the concept and posited as a quality. There is nothing whatever which cannot in this way be made into a moral law. There you go, Josh.
Yeah.
Every specific matter, however, is inherently particular, not universal. The opposite specific thing stands over against it, and it is specific only because there is this specific opposition. Both are equally capable of being thought. Which of the two is to be taken up into the unity or to be thought, and which is to be abstracted from, is completely open and free. If the one is fixed as absolutely subsistent, then, to be sure, the other cannot be posited. But this other can just as easily be thought, and since the form of thinking is the essence, expressed as an absolute moral law.
Yep.
Now, I don't know if Hegel brings up any examples of where he would show that this is the case. Like, it makes sense that this is the case. But when I try to think of, like, what would be two maxims that are actually of moral importance, where two opposite maxims would be consistent with each other on their own side. And I'm not quite sure how to do that. I've never seen an example, to be quite honest. Not that I have read many.
I'm trying to think of one.
Because the only things that come up to mind would have to be very specific maxims.
Yeah.
And it would also concern the fact of, like, a hierarchy of duties, for example, and then that would kind of make sense. Such that, for if you were in a life or death situation, or you were starving, and you had no means of subsistence, then it would be okay to steal. Because your right to life trumps the right to property. And in that case, respecting the right to property would be a lesser disrespect than the respect of property over life. Yeah, I don't know.
I think that kind of works.
Yeah. But they're not like immediately exactly opposed, really. So it doesn't quite fit in with what Hegel's saying here. I'm not sure. I'll have to think about that one. Quote, that the calmest untutored understanding can, unquote, engage in this easy operation and, quote, distinguish what form of maxim is or is not adapted for universal legislation, unquote, Kant shows by an example. I ask whether my maxim to increase my fortune by any and all safe means can hold good as a universal practical law in the case where appropriating a deposit entrusted to me has appeared to be such a means. The content of this law would be that anyone may deny having received a deposit for which there is no proof. This question is then decided by itself, because such a principle as law would destroy itself, since the result would be that no deposits would exist. But where is the contradiction if there were no deposits? The non-existence of deposits would contradict other specific things, just as the possibility of deposits fits together with other necessary specific things, and thereby will itself be necessary. But other ends and material grounds are not to be invoked. It is the immediate form of the concept, which is to settle the rightness of adopting either one specific matter or the other. For the form, however, one of the opposed specifics is just as valid as the other. Each can be conceived as a quality, and this conception can be expressed as a law. Okay, so this makes sense. So I was just thinking of the earlier stuff about like maxims within already established categories, but of course Hegel always goes for the categories. Because Kant doesn't specify that you can't make maxims of categories themselves. You know that the question of should we have property or should we not has equal answers either way. In this consideration, should we have deposits or should we not is equal. Because you could argue consistently for both. So let me reread that. So Kant shows by an example, I ask whether my maxim to increase my fortune by any and all safe means can hold good as a universal practical law in the case where appropriating a deposit entrusted to me has appeared to be such a means. The content of this law would be that anyone may deny having received a deposit for which there is no proof. He loses me there. I'm not quite sure where that comes from. I ask whether my maxim to increase my fortune by any and all safe means can hold good as a universal practical law in the case where appropriating a deposit entrusted to me has appeared to be such a means. The content of this law would be that anyone may deny having received a deposit for which there is no proof. I feel I'm missing something here because I'm not understanding why that is the content of this law.
Hyperion, you have any clue?
So I ask whether my maxim to increase my fortune by any and all safe means can hold good as a universal practical law in the case where appropriating a deposit entrusted to me has appeared to be such a means. Oh God, I'm stupid.
It's the...
Yeah, somebody gives you something, they entrust a deposit to you to go deposit it, and you decide to keep it. Now they have no proof that they gave you the deposit, and the bank has no proof there was a deposit, so anyone may deny having received a deposit for which there is no proof. So you can take the money and run, and nobody has any proof about it, so who's going to say? Except the person you stole it from, and what are they going to do? Except, maybe at this time they would fucking take you out for a duel and probably kill you. So this question is then decided by itself, because such a principle as a law would destroy itself, since the result would be that no deposits would exist. But where is the contradiction if there were no deposits? Okay, but where's the contradiction if there is no deposit? The non-existence of deposits would contradict other specific things, just as the possibility of deposits fits together with other necessary specific things, and thereby will itself be necessary. But other ends and material grounds are not to be invoked. It is the immediate form of the concept which is to settle the rightness of adopting either one specific matter or the other. For the form, however, one of the opposed specifics is just as valid as the other. Each can be conceived as a quality, and this conception can be expressed as a law. Yeah, okay, that makes perfect sense. If the specification of property in general be posited, then we can construct a tautological statement. Property is property and nothing else, and this tautological production is the legislation of this practical reason. Property, if property is, must be property. But if we posit the opposite thing, negation of property, then the legislation of this same practical reason produces the tautology. Non-property is non-property. If property is not to be, then whatever claims to be property must be cancelled. But the aim is precisely to prove that property must be. The sole thing at issue is what lies outside the capacities of practical legislation of pure reason, namely to decide which of the opposed specific things must be lawful. But pure reason demands that this shall have been done beforehand, and that one of the opposed specific things shall be presupposed, and only then can pure reason perform its now superfluous legislating. So the categories being employed as the presuppositions of any maxim are already the criterion of the truth. But if we don't assume them as a criterion of the truth, then nothing results from it. And all pure reason checks is then just does the consequence align with the presupposition? If not, then it is invalid. If so, it confirms the identity, therefore it's valid. But the analytic unity and tautology of practical reason is not only superfluous, but in its expression or exercise, it is false and must be recognized as the principle of immorality. The mere act of taking a specific thing up to the form of unity is supposed to alter the character of that thing's being. The specific thing, which by its nature has another specific thing over against it, the one being the negation of the other, and neither therefore being absolute. And so far as the functioning of practical reason goes, it does not matter which is which, for practical reason affords nothing but empty form. It is thus supposed by this union with the form of pure unity to become absolute, to become law and duty. But when a specific and individual thing is elevated to something inherently necessary, absurdity and immortal, and in the moral sphere, immorality, are posited. Let me reread that. But the analytic unity and tautology of practical reason is not only superfluous, but in its expression or exercise, it is false and must be recognized as the principle of immorality. The mere act of taking a specific thing up into the form of unity is supposed to alter the character of that thing's being. The specific thing by which its character, by which its nature has another specific thing over against it, the one being the negation of the other, and neither therefore being absolute. And so far as the functioning of practical reason goes, it does not matter which is which, for practical reason affords nothing but empty form. It is thus supposed by this union with a form of pure unity to become absolute, to become law and duty. But when a specific and individual thing is elevated to something inherently necessary, absurdity and in the moral sphere, immorality are posited. I'm going to reread the middle part. The mere act of taking a specific thing up into the form of unity is supposed to alter the character of that thing's being. Okay. The specific thing by which its nature has another specific thing over against it, the one being the negation of the other, and neither therefore being absolute, is thus supposed by this union with the form of pure unity to become absolute, to become law and duty. But when a specific and individual thing is elevated to something inherently necessary, absurdity and in the moral sphere, immorality are posited. So the critique here, as I'm understanding it, is because the categorical imperative can only get its content from finite things, it takes up finite specifications and universalizes them, therefore absolutizes them. But a finite particular content is for that very reason not absolute in being finite and particular. To then raise it to this formality of absoluteness is when a specific individual thing is elevated to something inherently necessary, absurdity, and in the moral sphere, immorality are posited. Absurdity, because obviously that one thing is not really the absolute. Immorality, because then the individual is raised to universality as without losing really that character of individuality. And therefore, this is the nature of evil. It's placing the individual as absolute over over its constituents and relating parts. Which is why something like the whole axe murder scenario, where you cannot lie, or a scenario where you may be starving but you may never steal. Which, by the way, I'm not entirely sure Kant says that. I have a vague memory that maybe he actually allows for that under certain specifications, but I mean the stealing to survive thing, but definitely not lying apparently. Yeah. So yeah, that makes sense actually. That makes sense that would be the result of this form of reasoning. This transformation of the conditioned and unreal into something unconditioned and absolute is easily recognized in its illegitimacy and easily caught in its underhanded means. When the specific concept is expressed in a sentence, the specific thing, taken up into the form of pure unity or formal identity, produces the tautology of the formal sentence. The specific A. The form, or in the sentence, the identity of subject and predicate, is something absolute, but only negative or formal, and the specific A is unaffected. For the form, this content is something wholly hypothetical. However, the absoluteness, which by virtue of the sentence form is in the sentence, acquires a totally different meaning in practical reason. Absoluteness is also confirmed on the content. Absoluteness is also conferred on the content, which by its nature is something conditioned. And this conditioned non-absolute, contrary to its own essence, is elevated into an absolute by this confusion. Producing a tautology is not the aim of practice, and practical reason would not take so much trouble for the sake of this idle form, which yet is all that is in its power. But by confusing absolute form with conditioned matter, the absoluteness of the form is imperceptibly smuggled into the unreal and conditioned character of the content. And in this perversion and trickery lies the nerve of pure reason's practical legislation. There is smuggled into the sentence property is property, not its proper meaning. That is, the identity which the sentence expresses in its form is absolute, but the meaning, the matter of the sentence, that is property, is absolute. And in this way, anything specific can be made into a duty. The arbitrary will has a choice between opposed specific things, and it would only be due to incompetence if, for any given action, some ground could not be found which acquires not just the form of a probable ground, as with the Jesuits, but the form of right and duty. This moral formalism does not exceed the moral skill of the Jesuits, or what coincides therewith, the principles of eudaimonism. I haven't read enough Hegel to get him to see him lambast the Catholics that much. It's usually the Jews I've encountered him ragging on. But if you're gonna dunk on one J, you might dunk on all of them. But the form of right and duty, So yeah, this makes a whole lot of sense of what we were having an issue with earlier about the opposed maxims then. So insofar as we don't suppose that property is a valid institution, then at least from the standpoint of, if you stated it from the standpoint of the categories of property without accepting those categories, you could say that it is right to steal and not be in contradiction. Because by stealing, you're denying property, and if you say that property should not exist, by stealing, you're doing the right thing, by ensuring that property indeed does not exist. I suppose a good concrete example would be slavery, where, insofar as you accept that slavery is a valid institution, then it is wrong for a slave to run away, because then they're undermining it's wrong for a slave to disobey. Runaway is also related. Because then they're undermining the very institution of the condition of being a slave. Because a slave is that they who obey a master. But if a slave disobeys a master, he's not doing what he ought to do, because it's in contradiction to being a slave. But if you just undermine the whole issue of slavery to begin with by not accepting the category as valid, then the slave not listening to the master is right to not listen to the master, because slavery should not exist. So, okay, I think that makes perfect sense of that issue. What do you think of that, Josh? Is that a good example?
Sorry, what's the example again?
That a slave, if we assume that slavery is a valid institution, then the maximum, that I should do whatever I want, for example, or I should do whatever I will as a slave, is contradictory and therefore immoral, quote unquote, because a slave is one who obeys their master, not who, just does whatever they want. But if you don't accept the validity of the category of slavery, then a slave doing, or disobeying their master is the right thing to do, because slavery should not exist. And so insofar as slavery is something that seems to exist, the proper thing to do is to not obey a master if you're placed into that condition.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
So there you get two contradictory things about the same thing, which are valid from their standpoints. Which brings us to what you were saying earlier, that example of, well, what if I'm okay with it, with something? So, what if I steal from everybody, but I'm okay with everybody stealing from me? Then you are being consistent, because by that you're showing that you don't accept the validity of property, and you don't believe that property should exist, and therefore you still going and stealing is the proper thing to do. Hold on, give me a sec. Give me a minute. Feedback, hello.
Welcome back.
Okay, where were we? So, single property is property, it's not its proper meaning. The identity which the sentence expresses in its form is absolute, but the meaning, the matter of the sentence is absolute. Okay, so they switch in the form for the matter when they shouldn't. In this way, anything specific can be made into a duty. The arbitrary will has a choice between opposed specific things, and it would only be due to the incompetence if for any given action some ground could not be found which acquires not just the form of a probable ground, as with Jesuits, but the form of right and duty. This moral formalism does not exceed the moral skill of the Jesuits, or what coincides with the principles of eudaimonism. Okay, I wonder if he's going to critique that. It is well to note in this connection that adoption of the specific thing into the concepts is understood in the sense that this adoption is something formal, or that the specific thing is supposed to remain, so that matter and form contradict one another, the first being delimited and the second infinite. But if the content were really equated with the form and the specific thing with a unity, then no practical legislation could occur, but only the annihilation of the specific. Thus property itself is directly opposed to universality. Equated with it, it is superseded. Okay, let me read that. It is well to note in this connection that adoption of the specific thing into the concept is understood in the sense that this adoption is something formal, or that specific things, or that the specific thing is supposed to remain, so that matter and form contradict one another, the first being delimited and the second infinite. But if the content were really equated with the form and the specific thing with a unity, then no practical legislation could occur, but only annihilation of the specific. Thus property itself is directly opposed to universality. Equated with it, it is superseded. Okay. One more time. It is well to note in this connection that adoption of a specific thing into the concept is understood in the sense that this adoption is something formal, or that the specific thing is supposed to remain, so that matter and form contradict one another, the first being delimited and the second infinite. Okay, so the form is what is absolute, and the matter is particular and finite, and therefore the matter itself does not rise to infinity. But if the content were really equated with the form and the specific thing with a unity, then no practical legislation would occur, but only the annihilation of the specific. So if property were absolute and infinite, then it would not be a finite thing, and it would have no relations, and it would just disappear. It would annihilate itself. It would be nothing. It would just be a pure formalism again. Thus, property itself is directly opposed to universality, insofar as it is a particular and the universal is the infinite. Equated with it, it is superseded. Here it seems that this was meant as cancelled. This annihilation of the specific through its adoption into infinity and universality is indeed an immediate difficulty for practical legislation. For if the specific thing is such that in itself it expresses the supersession of something specific, then by the elevation of the supersession to universality, or to the state of having been superseded, not only the specific thing which is to be superseded, but the superseding itself is cancelled. Thus, a maxim referring to such a specific thing which cancels itself when it is universalized would not be capable of being the principle of a universal legislation, and so would be immoral. Alternatively, the maxim's content, which is the supersession of a specific thing, contradicts itself when it is raised to the concept. If the specific is thought as superseded, its supersession falls away. Or else, if this specific is supposed to remain, then it turns the supersession laid down in the maxim, let me read that. If the specific is thought as superseded, its supersession falls away. Or else, if the specific is supposed to remain, then in turn the supersession laid down in the maxim is not laid down. Thus, whether the specific remains or not, in either case its supersession is impossible. But a maxim which is in principle immoral because self-contradictory is absolutely rational, and so absolutely moral because it expresses the supersession of a specific thing. For the rational in its negative aspect is the indifference of specifications, the supersession of the conditioned. Thus, the specific injunction, help the poor, expresses the supersession of the specific thing, poverty. The maxim, help the poor, tested by being elevated into a principle of universal legislation, will prove to be false because it annihilates itself. So if everybody helps the poor, there will be no poor, and therefore it contradicts itself. But this is good.
Mm-hmm.
If the thought is that the poor generally should be helped, then either there are no poor left, or there are nothing but poor. In the latter event, no one is left to help them. In both cases, the help disappears. Thus, the maxim universalized cancels itself. And I've never seen anybody actually explain this whole argument well before. It's actually pretty good.
A help for the poor leaves the whole world poor.
On the other hand, if the specific thing which is to be superseded, that is poverty, were to remain, the possibility of help remains, but only as a possibility, not as the actually envisaged by the maxim. Not as the actuality envisaged by the maxim. If poverty is to remain in order that the duty of helping the poor can be fulfilled, this maintenance of poverty forthwith becomes that the duty is not fulfilled. So the maxim is honorably defending one's country. So the maxim of honorably defending one's country against its enemies, like an infinite number of other maxims, is self-canceling as soon as it is thought of as a principle of universal legislation. For when so universalized, for example, the specification of country, enemies, and defense is cancelled.
This is just theoretical. It's not.
This is good, though. I mean,
Yeah.
I think he spent way too many pages going over inane details that don't really help the argument that he's making. And he should have just gone, far more into the details like these. These are, concrete examples, rather than running around the bush, telling you about the form and the ideal and the universal and that stuff. As a matter, he should have started with this, I think, because even I was a bit confused with the way he was describing things, because it's just, it doesn't really help. But if you put this and then you interspersed it with specific things about what's going on, that would have been a lot more helpful to enlighten people as to the method going on. So unity does not have the purely negative meaning of the mere cancellation of specific things, nor is it the true unity of perception or the positive indifference of these specifications. A comparison with this latter unity will clarify the perverted essence of the former in another aspect. The unity of practical reason, namely, is essentially affected with a difference because it is defined either as the fixing of one specific thing, whereby others are immediately excluded, posited negatively, or as an analytic sentence, in which the case, the identity of the sentence, its form, forthwith contradicts its content. So in other words, as a sentence with its content, the analytic sentence contradicts the requirement that the sentence be a judgment. The sentence was supposed to say something, but a tautological sentence says nothing, for it is not a judgment, because the relation of subject to predicate is purely formal, and no difference between them is posited. All right, let me read this. Okay. That unity of practical reason, namely, is essentially affected with a difference, because it is defined either as the fixing of one specific thing, whereby others are immediately excluded, posited negatively, or as an analytic sentence, in which case the identity of the sentence, its form, forthwith contradicts its content. So the unity of practical reason contradicts itself in that it has to not only presuppose, but also maintain difference, particularity. So it's supposed to be a universality, an absolute universality, and yet it has to also posit an absolute particularity in order to even be. Likewise, analytic sentence is not properly a sentence, because a sentence is a judgment, but an analytic sentence is basically just saying that really it's all one thing, one identity, and that all these parts of the sentence are just appearances of that one identity. The sentence was supposed to say something, but a tautological sentence says nothing. It's like saying today is Monday, which is not, but and then somebody asks you, like, what do you mean? And you're like, well, today is Monday. It's like, this is an apple. Like, well, what is an apple? It's an apple.
There's nothing said about it. There's no judgment being made.
Alternatively, if the unity is taken as universality, then it refers entirely to an empirical multiplicity, and the present specification will be opposed to an endless throng that are empirically different. On the other hand, the unity of perception is the indifference of the specifications which make up a whole. It is not the fixing of them as separate and opposed, but their summation and objectification. Since this indifference and the different specifications are plainly united, this unity of perception is not a cleavage between indifference as possibility and the difference as actualities, not a cleavage between the difference, some as possible and others as actual. All are actually present in it, and in this force of perception and presentness lies the force of morality in general, and naturally also of morality in particular, with which this legislating reason is primarily concerned, and from which that form of the concept of formal unity and universality must rather be kept entirely separate. For this form is precisely what directly cancels the essence of morality, since it makes the morally necessary into something contingent by causing morality to appear in opposition to other matters. In morality, however, contingency which coincides with the empirically necessary is immoral. A pain is lifted by the force of perception from feeling, where it is something accidental and contingent, into unity in the shape of something objective and absolutely necessary. By this immediate unity, which does not trouble at all about the possibilities which formal unity entails, it is maintained in its absolute presentness. Owing, however, to the objectivity of perception and the elevation of independent being into this unity, it is genuinely severed from the subject and made ideal in the fixed perception of this unity. On the other hand, when compared to the unity of reflection with other specifications, or considered and rejected as a universal, this pain is, in either case, made contingent. As a result, the subject knows himself purely in this contingency and particularity, which knowledge is the sentimentality and the morality of impotence. Alternatively, if morality bears on relations between individuals, it is pure perception and ideality, which has to be maintained and preserved from the interference of formal unity and the thought of the possibility of other specific features. The expression of that unity of perception, quote, a property of someone else entrusted to me is the property of someone else entrusted to me and nothing else, has a totally different meaning from the tautology expressed in universal terms of practical legislation. Quote, another's property entrusted to me is another's property entrusted to me, unquote. For the latter sentence may equally well be confronted by this other. Quote, what is not another's property entrusted to me is not the property of the other, end quote. This means that a specific feature elevated into the concept is thereby made ideal, and its opposite specific feature may be opposite just as easily. On the other hand, the expression of perception contains a this, a living relation and absolute presentness, with which the possibility is itself absolutely linked, and whereby a possibility separated therefrom, or a being other, is absolutely annihilated, because in such a possible being other lies immorality. Okay, I suppose I'm gonna have to go back. I thought he was just kind of like being facetious with this perception stuff, but I guess he's going all in, so kind of lost the thread there, but let me try to get back on this. So that unity of practical reason, namely it's essentially affected with the difference because it's defined, okay. Alternatively, if the unity is taken as universality, when it refers entirely to an empirical multiplicity, the present specification will be opposed to an endless throng of that are empirically different. On the other hand, the unity of perception is the indifference of the specifications which make up the whole. It is not the fixing of them as separate and opposed, but their summation and objectification. Since this difference and the different specifications are plainly united, this unity of perception is not a cleavage between indifference as possibility and the difference as actuality, not as cleavage between the difference, some as possible and others as actual. All are actually present in it. Alright, now what the hell is he talking about? So on the other hand, the unity of perception is the indifference of the specifications which make up a whole. It is not the fixing of them as separate and opposed, but their summation and objectification. Since this indifference and the different specifications are plainly united, this unity of perception is not a cleavage between indifference as possibility and the difference as actualities. Not a cleavage between the difference, some as possible and others as actual. All are actually present in it. Okay, so that's clear enough. Perception makes no difference between whatever is before it as different kinds or anything. It just has them all as actually present at once. And in this force of perception and presentness lies the force of morality in general. And naturally also of morality in particular, with which this legislating reason is primarily concerned, and from which that form of the concept of formal unity and universality must rather be kept entirely separate. For this form is precisely what directly cancels the essence of morality, since it makes the morally necessary into something contingent by causing morality to appear in opposition to other matters. In morality, however, contingency which coincides with the empirically necessary is immoral. So my understanding of this by reading here right now is that just as perception makes no judgments about possibilities or actualities, and what is present before it is all actual, regardless of what kinds they are. Morality here likewise suffers this same exact form, in that what is present before it are a plurality, an infinite plurality of moral principles or maxims, which can be taken validly each against the other. But in taking any single one, which is the only thing that because if it accepts itself as completely universal, it remains absolutely indifferent, just like perception does, and therefore makes no judgment and is an utterly it's not a moral capacity at that point. Morality ceases to be moral in that, it makes no judgments about morality anymore. It just is. So, this pure formalism obviously is useless, so obviously we have to do something with it. The only way we could do that is obviously we have to go with the particulars. But if we choose any particulars, we raise that to a we cannot raise that to the universal. We've already seen what happens with that. If you raise it to the absolute universal, it's a nothing. But if you maintain the difference between the moral universal and the particular content, you likewise are left in immorality, in that morality is itself turned to a particular, along with that particular.
I feel like that's exactly the point I was making just a while ago.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm glad I was thinking along the same lines as Hegel.
That's what happens when you align your mind with the universal, Josh. You just start thinking it. So anyways, continuing, and in this case, this thing about perception is also where he says, and in this force of perception, present in its lies the force of morality in general, and naturally also morality in particular, with which this legislating reason is primarily concerned, and from which that form of the concept of formal unity and universality must rather be kept entirely separate. For this form is precisely what directly cancels the essence of morality, since it makes the morally necessary into something contingent, in a particular, by causing morality to appear in opposition to other matters, because you choose one particular maxim, which assumes a set of finite categories, and which then puts you in opposition to the morality of someone with the opposite or different categories. Therefore, morality becomes immoral. In morality, however, contingency, which coincides with the empirically necessary, is immoral, because morality is supposed to be the absolute universal. But if it's not the absolute universal, it's actually just a contingent based on whatever empirical things you happen to have grasped on, then clearly morality becomes immoral, it becomes evil, it becomes one-sided, and it's not good. A pain is lifted by the force of perception from feeling, where it is something accidental and contingent, into unity in the shape of something objective and absolutely necessary. Not quite sure in what sense he's talking about that here. And by this immediate unity, which does not trouble at all about the possibilities which formal unity entails, it is maintained in its absolute presentness. So a pain is lifted by force of perception from feeling, where it is something accidental and contingent, into unity in the shape of something objective and absolutely necessary. The only way that makes sense to me is insofar as pain as such is something necessary. Like, feeling would just be, like sensation as such, indifferent. Then pain specifies that sensation, and then pain itself is specified within the totality of perception as a necessary component of feeling perception, as part of the system of feelings. That's the only way that this makes sense to me. And by this immediate unity, which does not trouble at all about the possibilities which formal unity entails, it is maintained in its absolute presentness. Because in the system, the entire system of perception is in that contingent feeling entirely specified as pain in that moment. Of its own accord, not because there's some kind of formal rule about pain that it's adhering to. Owing, however, to the objectivity of perception and the elevation of independent being into this unity, it is genuinely severed from the subject and made ideal in the fixed perception of this unity. So, owing, however, to the objectivity of perception and the elevation of independent being into this unity, it is genuinely severed from the subject and made ideal in the fixed perception of this unity. So I'm going to assume he means ideal here in the same sense that he means it later in the logic, that it's made a part of the unity. But it always was a part of the unity as that capacity. From random sensations you pick up pain, but pain is a determination of perception itself in this case. And it's perception that is the objectivity and the elevation of independent being, which has risen to the unity of perception. So pain is genuinely severed from the subject. I don't know what the subject in here is in made ideal and fixed perception. Oh, okay. So pain is severed from the subject in that, like we make a distinction between I am in pain and like we don't say I am pain. So pain is idealized in the fixed perception of this unity. Okay, that makes sense. On the other hand, when compared by the unity of reflection with other specifications or considered and rejected as universal, this pain is in either case made contingent. As a result, the subject knows himself purely in his contingency and particularity, which knowledge is the sentimentality and the morality of impotence. So on the other hand, when compared by the unity of reflection with other specifications or considered and rejected as a universal, this pain is in either case made contingent. So, with the understanding, we perceive pain and we say, well, I am not pain, so pain is not universal. But this pain is either case made contingent. But, we can imagine, I am not pain, this pain is, impinging upon me, but I could be without this pain, essentially. As a result, the subject knows himself purely in his contingency and particularity, which knowledge is the sentimentality in the immorality of impotence. Yeah, I suppose, this would be an attack against all these philosophies of, where pain and suffering bad, always. And if we could get rid of it entirely, absolutely, we should. And that's because, we see ourselves as separate and not constituted and by pain. There's a great quote in Science of Logic, Chapter 2, in the section of the finite, particularly with the ought, where Hegel says it is the privilege of the pain is the privilege of the animal. Where pain is a necessary determination and constitution of the animal. So, it's not like we could be without being. Well, no, we could be without pain. That's not what he's saying. So it's not like that. So it's the opposite, in which pain is part of a necessary set of determinations without which we couldn't really be the kind of beings that we are. We couldn't really have intelligence in the proper sense. How intelligent are you going to be if you can't feel pain and therefore don't have an intuitive, unignorable mental experience of things going wrong on physical and psychological levels? Pain at least serves the function of signaling that something is wrong and that your consciousness needs to focus on that and figure out what the heck is going on. If you didn't have pain, you could do plenty of things wrong and you would just destroy yourself. And so any morality which which, for example, then said, you have to reduce pain or get rid of pain, which suffer the sentimentality and immorality of impotence, because impotence would be immoral because we shouldn't, pain should not exist. We should not be feeling pain, and we feel pain because impotence. We don't have the power to get rid of it. Therefore, impotence is immoral because pain is bad. And because of impotence, we can't get rid of pain. I don't know. Am I making sense? Am I making sense here?
I get what you mean.
All right, Josh. So, alternatively, if morality bears on relations between individuals, it is pure perception and ideality. For example, the entrusting of a deposit, which has to be maintained and preserved from the interference of formal unity and the thought of possibility of other specific features. So alternatively, if morality bears on relations between individuals, it is pure perception and ideality, which has to be maintained and preserved from the interference of formal unity and the thought of the possibility of other specific features. I'm not quite sure if this is something which is defending morality or attacking it. Preserved from the interference of formal unity and the thought of the possibility of specific features. I don't know how it would have to be maintained and preserved from the interference of formal unity. I know how it has to be like preserved from the thought of the possibility of other specific features, but I'm not entirely sure about formal unity. Unless he's recalling back to what he was saying earlier, where the strong formal unity will destroy the very objects. So the expression of that unity of perception, a property of someone else entrusted to me, is the property of someone else entrusted to me and nothing else, has a totally different meaning from the tautology expressed in universal terms of practical legislation. Another's property entrusted to me is another's property entrusted to me. For the latter sentence may equally well be confronted by this other. What is not another's property entrusted to me is not the property of the other, which means that a specific feature elevated into the concept is thereby made ideal, and its opposite specific feature may be posited just as easily. Okay, so the first form of that, a property of someone else entrusted to me is the property of someone else entrusted to me and nothing else, has a totally different meaning from the tautology expressed in universal terms of practical legislation. Another's property entrusted to me is another's property entrusted to me. For the latter sentence may be equally well confronted by this other. What is not another's property entrusted to me is not the property of the other. I'm not quite seeing what the grammatical difference is here. Wouldn't it make, okay, you could say, what is not the property of someone else entrusted to me is not the property of someone else entrusted to me and nothing else. Okay, well, no, yeah, that doesn't quite work. Another's property entrusted to me is another's property entrusted to me. What is not another's property entrusted to me? No, I still don't see it. Because he could have just flipped it around. Well, no, I get what he's saying. Yeah. I just don't see what the point of the grammatical change is. Because it seems to, well, I mean, the phrasing.
Yeah.
What does it change? I don't get it, because he flips it either way. Maybe in German, like, the grammar works different. But in English, you could have just said, what is not a property of someone else entrusted to me is not someone else's property. Because the same thing works. Why would you have to rephrase it to another's property entrusted to me is another's property entrusted to me?
Wait.
Are you just having problems with or like you have a disagreement with the grammatical difference between the two? Or you don't get what he's trying to say?
I know what he's trying to say. I just don't get, why did he bring up this phrasing point? I don't see it. He brought it up because he thinks it's important. I don't see what's important about it.
I can't tell. I'm like trying to think of like what it would be in German, and I don't think there's any significant difference either. At least I don't think there would be.
Yeah, property of someone else entrusted to me is the property of someone else entrusted to me. Another's property entrusted to me is another's property entrusted to me.
I mean, another's property is the same as a property of someone else.
No, because yes and no, because he's talking about another, like the third would be an other. It's not the same as the someone. That's the point he's trying to make, but I don't think it comes across that well. Because what is not another's property entrusted to me is not the property of the other. It is the property of the someone who entrusts it to me.
Okay, now that you pointed it out, I kind of see where he's going.
Yeah.
It still doesn't seem like to be worth saying it, because a property, because what is not a property of someone else entrusted to me is not the property of someone else.
They entrusted to you, it's still their property.
No, but it's not the property of someone else entrusted to me, therefore it's not the property of someone else.
Yeah, it's not the property of a someone else. I don't know, it's weird.
And another's property, what is it? What is not another's property entrusted to me is not the property of the other.
Yeah.
I don't see the point. I see the point, but I don't see why he had to make this distinction between the sentences. You can say it makes sense to me just fine either way. As not the property of someone else, it's not someone else's property. If it's not the property of another, then it's not the property of the other. Or of an other. I mean, that's a sleight of hand right there, going from an other to the other.
Yeah.
This means that a specific feature elevated into the concept is thereby made ideal, and its opposite specific feature may be posited just as easily. I suppose that maybe he's pointing out that in one form of these sentences, the emphasis on the subject and predicate is different. But
doesn't really seem to be.
Anyways, let's move on. So this means that a specific feature elevated into the concept is thereby made ideal. So, the property is raised up to the concept. It is idealized, is made part and not absolute. And its opposite specific feature may be posited just as easily. So, insofar as it is part, it has an opposite because it's particular. It's finite. On the other hand, the expression of perception contains a this, a living relation in absolute presentness with which the possibility is itself absolutely linked, and whereby possibility separated therefrom, or a being other, is absolutely annihilated, because in such a possible being other lies immorality. So, insofar as perception takes its objects and categories as given and then chooses them out that way, it has a this, which is absolute presentness, with which the possibility is itself absolutely linked. The possibility is a full actuality. It is this, it's there, and whereby possibility separated therefrom, or being other, is absolutely annihilated, because in such a possible being other lies immorality. So at least in the form of morality, once the moral is empirically given in the empirical content for moral maxims, you just take what is given. That locks in the possibility. It is the actuality. Therefore, the being other is annihilated, because the actuality negates the other possibility, and that other possibility would be a contradiction and therefore immoral. Right. Now, if the unity of practical reason were not this positive unity of perception, but had only the negative meaning of annihilating anything specific, it would then simply express the essence of negative reason, or of infinity, or the absolute concept. But because this infinity is fixed and sundered from the absolute, it shows itself in its essence to be its own opposite. It mocks reflection, which wishes to hold it fast and grasp in it an absolute unity by producing the opposite of this study as well, a difference in multiplicity. In the midst of this clash, which is reproduced ad infinitum by permitting only a relative identity, whereby even as infinity it is the opposite of itself, namely absolute finitude, and by being so isolated it is itself only the powerless form, forsaken by the truly annihilating might of reason, the form which takes in specifications and harbors them within itself, not annihilating them, but on the contrary, perpetuating them. On the opposition which has been expounded, on the fixing of it as a reality and its complete colligation as a relative identity. What the heck is this? Sorry, let me read that. On the opposition which has been expounded, on the fixing of it as a reality and its incomplete colligation as a relative identity, there hangs the recent definition of the concept of natural law in its relation to the whole science of ethics. Hitherto our analysis has been in general terms. We must now consider in more detail how the separation, insuperable once made, appears in its own special way in the science of natural law. Okay. It's a good transition point. This is had more content than the other portion we read, the first one, but boy, the arguments were a lot more convoluted. You can you can really see that Hegel really got a lot better at communicating these ideas as he went on. Because honestly, a lot of this feels like extremely over-convoluted, because he himself is not yet exactly clear on like what proper ways to relate this stuff. Like once you catch on to what's going on, yeah, it makes sense. But Christ, that's quite a bit. Anyways,
taking a trip around Harvey's barn to get there.
Yeah. Anyways, for those of you listening, hopefully you find it interesting. See you next time.